Okay, so today's video is going to focus on tissues, which are, remember, groups of cells that have similar function that are working together. So we'll be looking at the 4 basic types of tissues, and we'll be kind of doing a brief overview of each one. And then when you're with your microscopes, you'll look closer at more specific examples of them. So the first type of tissue that we're going to talk about is what's called epithelial tissue. Okay, and so epithelial tissue is one of our 4 groups of tissues. And epithelial tissue is going to cover the body and line hollow spaces. So basically body cavities. So it's going to cover, for instance, your skin would be an example of epithelial tissue. Skin tissue that you find covering the surface of an organ. And then tissue that would line open spaces like your mouth, your nose, your inside of your stomach, your intestines. So epithelial tissue as a whole is going to cover and line. And it's going to have 4 basic functions. It can offer protection. Okay? It can offer the fact that, for instance, your skin has lots and lots and lots of layers. So when you lose the first few layers, it doesn't make a difference. It offers some protection there. Okay? It can regulate things. It can control what goes in and out. It can do things like filtration. So it can filter, like you'll find epithelial tissue in the kidneys helping to filter things. So it can do filtration, it can do diffusion, which remember also is your passive movement of things back and forth. Okay, it also can do absorption. So it can, in particular, if you think about the intestines, it can absorb the nutrients through those epithelial cells. So by regulation there, that's how it can regulate things. It can monitor what goes in and out with the filtration, diffusion, absorption properties. Epithelial tissue could provide sensory information depending upon where the epithelial tissue is located, as well as epithelial tissue can do secretion. For instance, it could secrete mucus, okay, from goblet cells. So epithelial tissue, depending upon where it is, can have one of these 4 basic functions here. So this is our generic structure of all epithelial tissue. So our generic structure of epithelial tissue is that it's going to have an apical surface. This apical surface is what we call the free surface. It is the surface that is exposed. If you remember, this tissue is found covering things. So if it's found covering something, there's going to be an exposed or free surface. If it is found lining something, so here's all my epithelial tissue here lining the inside of this tube. Let's say this is a blood vessel. So all of this lining the inside of the tube here is epithelial tissue. And that would be my apical surface on the inside of this tube here. So the apical surface is the exposed or the free surface. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the top. Again, remember, this is going to line hollow organs. So I'm going to have a free or exposed surface on the inside. That surface could be on the bottom. Okay? It's just going to be the open, free, exposed surface. The basal membrane is going to be the opposite side of that. So the basal surface or the basal membrane is going to be the opposite side of that free edge, and that's going to be what helps anchor the epithelial tissue in. That basal surface is also sometimes called the basement membrane. So if you see basement membrane, you need to be thinking this basal surface or the opposite of the apical surface. If you look, for instance, at the pictures that we have here, this would be my apical surface here on the top. This would be my basement membrane here on the bottom, anchoring those cells down and in so they don't always get torn apart. Okay? Because remember, these cells are on a free surface, which means things are going to cross over them most likely. Some other characteristics of epithelial cells in general is that they are going to be closely packed together. Okay? You'll see how there's no gaps in these cells. These cells are all nice and close together. No gaps, even if it's a single layer. So as a general rule, your epithelial cells will be nice and closely packed together. They are avascular, which means on their own, they have no blood supply. So there is no blood vessels that directly go to this epithelial tissue. what happens is the blood supply is going to be located here in this basement membrane. And that basement membrane is going to nourish the cells that are closest to it. And if it's a really thick layer of epithelial tissue, the cells that are far away from the basement membrane, they will end up being dead. That's how your skin cells work. Okay? The cells down by the base are well nourished because the nutrients can diffuse from that basement membrane to those cells. So they are well nourished. But the cells that are further away, the nutrients can't diffuse that far and those cells die, which is why the cells on the very surface of our skin are dead. Now this epithelial tissue, again, these are generic characteristics of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, if it is close to that blood supply, will regenerate really, really well. So if it's down by that basement membrane and is really close to that blood supply, it will regenerate and grow very rapidly. That's why your skin is constantly growing and dividing. Those cells that are down low by that basement membrane, they're getting lots of nourishment. They're growing, they're dividing. It's how your hair grows. The ends of your hair, those cells are too far away, so those cells are dead. But the cells that are close to the anchored in basal membrane, they're getting lots of blood. They regenerate quickly. They push the other cells out, and your hair grows longer. So epithelial tissue in general can either have one of the four functions: protection, regulation, sensory information, or secretion. And all epithelial tissue is going to have these same basic structural components: an apical or a free surface, a basal surface that anchors it in and helps supply the nutrients, the fact that the cells themselves don't have a direct blood supply, they are avascular, and however, if those cells are close to that basement membrane, they will regenerate quickly because they're getting plenty of nourishment. So epithelial cells can be classified into three basic shapes. Okay? The first shape is this flattened squamous shape. It looks like the cell basically has been squished down. It's sometimes called the fried egg, okay? Because the nucleus will kind of bulge up in the cell because the cell has been squished so flat. These cells are very skinny, very squished down. The next one is your cuboidal. It's roughly square-shaped. Again, remember we're talking about animal cells here, so I'm not going to have perfect corners. These usually look like this in the cell. So I don't have nice perfect corners because I don't have cell walls, but it's roughly cube-shaped. Basically, I have about the same amount of cytoplasm all the way around that nucleus, where in the squamous cell, I don't have the same amount of cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus. So the cuboidal cell, I'll have kind of an even amount of cytoplasm all the way around the nucleus. And then that leaves our third shape to be the columnar cells. The columnar cells are going to be taller than they are wide, and they're going to have a lot of, they're basically going to be rectangular. Okay, so they're going to be rectangular or shaped like a column. So your epithelial cells have these three basic shapes: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Okay, and then from there, they also can be divided into whether they're stratified or simple. So a simple epithelial tissue has one layer of cells, and that's it. One layer of cells only, no more layers of cells. A stratified epithelial tissue arrangement is going to have multiple layers. It could be 2, it could be hundreds. Okay? And then we also have what's called the transitional epithelial cells, where these cells are stretchable. Basically, the cell will look like it's a single layer because the cells will be kind of rounded out, but then when that tissue gets stretched out, so the cell may look like it's stratified, but then when that tissue gets stretched out, those cells will stretch out. And so then they'll look simple. So that's what it means by this transitional layer. They're stretchable, and those cells are a little bit more flexible. We're going to focus on the simple versus stratified. So when I name epithelial cells, I name them based upon the amount of layers they have and then their shape. So for instance, in this example here, in this first square there, I would name this tissue, it would be simple, because it only has one layer, squamous epithelial tissue. Where it gets a little bit different is when you run into the stratified layers. If I look at this stratified squamous tissue over here on the right, I can easily see how I have multiple layers here. But if you look, this bottom layer close to the basement membrane, it looks kind of cuboidal. But then the top layer looks like it's squamous tissue. So we name the tissue based off of that apical or free surface. So that apical or free surface. So in this instance, this is stratified because it's more than one layer. Squamous because the apical or free surface is squamous or squished looking. Epithelial tissue. So the next one down, this one, again, multiple layers, so stratified. But this time my apical or free surface looks cuboidal. So stratified, cuboidal, epithelial tissue. Same with down here. My layers by the basement membrane look cuboidal, but my free surface layer looks columnar. So stratified, columnar, epithelial tissue. And then these two just have one layer of cells, so it's simple, and then whatever shape that one layer is. Simple cuboidal, simple columnar. Okay, so you have to make sure when you're naming your epithelial tissues that you look first at the amount of layers, and then you look at the shape of the apical or free surface if it's stratified, if it has more than one layer. Okay, most of our glands are going to be made of epithelial tissue. If it's an epithelial gland, it's going to secrete a particular substance. Okay, it might secrete oil. It might secrete sweat. It might be a hormone gland, so it's secreting hormones. Okay, those are some of the basic things that these glands can secrete. And we have two basic types of glands. You have an exocrine gland and you have an endocrine gland. An exocrine gland is going to have a duct associated with it. Okay, so it's going to have a duct or a tube associated with that. You can see that in all of these pictures here. They all have a duct or a tube that lead usually up to a surface. These are going to be your oil glands, your sweat glands. Those are going to be exocrine glands. They're going to secrete up onto a surface. So they'll have a duct that will travel up through the layers of skin to reach the surface. So those exocrine glands can be divided a couple of ways. You can have unicellular exocrine glands and you can have multicellular exocrine glands. And then you could have what's called simple versus compound exocrine glands. A simple exocrine gland is going to have one single duct. Okay, so it'll have one single duct. So you can see in this first row right here, even though the base of the gland may look a little bit different, they all have one single duct. Where a compound gland is going to have bases, or the duct will branch. Okay, you can see the branching of the duct all throughout here. So the duct itself is branching. Okay, so simple, one duct. Compound, a branching duct. Okay, and at the base of the duct, where the actual secretory unit is, so this part that's kind of like this purplish gray color, that's the actual secretory unit, the part that's actually going to secrete the oil or the sweat. Okay, that is going to have a couple of basic shapes. And the ones we're going to be concerned with are this tubular shape, so it'll be kind of long and skinny, or roughly tube-shaped, or this alveolar shape, which is going to be spherical shaped. So regardless of whether the duct is simple or compound, it's the tubular or alveolar part comes from the shape at the base of the duct, that secretory unit. So a compound tubular duct a compound tubular exocrine gland would have a branch duct with tubular secretory units, where a compound alveolar exocrine gland has a branched duct with round or spherical alveolar secretory units. Okay, so those are your exocrine glands. Again, sweat, oil, mucus. You'll see a lot of mucus glands that'll look like this kind of tubular, this simple tubular. Endocrine glands, these are going to be your hormone glands. These have no duct. Okay, a lot of people remember this because I have an N and a D right here. No duct, right? No duct. So these release their hormones. Again, these are hormone glands. These release their hormones right into the directly into the bloodstream so that things can travel throughout the body. So these aren't going to the surface. They don't need a duct to penetrate up through the skin. They are traveling. They are traveling right into the bloodstream for the bloodstream to take the secretion where it needs to go. And again, these are our hormone glands. Okay, so that's our epithelial tissue. Your epithelial tissue is going to be your biggest category with kind of the most information in it. The other three types will go much faster. We're going to talk about connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So starting first with connective tissue. So connective tissue is a wide variety of tissue types. Okay? Its basic jobs is that it's going to strengthen body organs and the body itself. For instance, bone is an example of connective tissue, so is cartilage. Okay? The tissue that the ligaments and tendons are made out of, those are connective tissues. So strong and reinforcing the body. Along that line, they're also going to offer protection. Right, again, we mentioned bone as an example of connective tissue. So it's going to offer protection to other parts of your body. Adipose tissue or fat is an example of connective tissue. Adipose tissue offers protection for some of your internal organs. Okay. Blood is an example of connective tissue, offers immune protection. So there's a wide variety of tissues that fall under this connective tissue category. So they're going to offer strength, they're going to offer protection, they're going to help maintain the shape of certain organs. For instance, in the trachea, which is the tube going down your throat, you have rings of cartilage that help maintain your throat opening so that it doesn't collapse down on you every time you breathe in and out. Okay? They also provide a framework for muscle attachment. Muscles can pull all day long, but if they don't have anything to pull on, you actually won't see any kind of movement. So they provide the strong, sturdy attachment for those muscles to pull on and to not cause damage. So these are kind of your basic functions of your connective tissue. So all of your connective tissue is going to be made of two basic parts. You're going to have cells and you're going to have what's called an extracellular matrix. So an extracellular matrix, extra would be outside of the cell. So all connective tissue is going to have cells. We mentioned bone as an example of connective tissue. Bone has cells in it. That's how your bone's able to heal. That's how it's able to grow. That's how it's able to, repair itself. So they're all going to have cells, and they're all going to have an extracellular matrix. What will make these tissues very different is what the extracellular matrix is made out of. So the extracellular matrix is always going to be made out of ground substance and fibers. The ground substance is going to be the liquid part of it. And the fibers will be the more solid part. And so depending upon the connective tissue, it might have more ground substance and less fibers, or it might have lots of fibers and very little ground substance. Let's take our two kind of polar opposite examples of tissue here. Okay, we said that blood was a connective tissue and bone was a connective tissue. Both have cells. That's a given. It's going to have cells. They both have this extracellular matrix that surrounds the cells. But the blood has a lot of the ground substance, lots of liquid, and very few fibers, where the bone has lots of fibers and very little of the ground substance. So they both have the cells. They both have the extracellular matrix. It's just the proportions that the ground substance and the fibers appear in. So out of those fibers, there is three basic types of fibers that you could see. Okay, we have collagen fibers, and you can see these fibers over here in this picture over here. So you have collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are really, really strong, and they're resistant to stretch. They offer a lot of tensile strength, meaning I can stretch them and I can pull them, and they're probably not going to rip apart. Now I can overstretch them, and they may not bounce back to their original shape, super great, okay, but they won't, they're harder to tear apart. So they're strong. They only allow for a certain amount of stretch, okay, because of their strength, because of that tensile strength that they have. Your elastic fibers, these are the ones that are elastic. As a general rule, when you stretch these will rebound. They are not plastic. You don't stretch them and then they won't return to their original shape. Collagen in some ways can be plastic. I stretch it and it doesn't return to its original shape. My elastic fibers allow for some more of that stretch and that rebound so that the tissue doesn't stay stretched out and wonky and no longer its original shape. The reticular fibers you don't see as often. The reticular fibers are the fibers you're going to see in, for instance, your spleen or your lymph nodes. These are the fibers that are going to help filter things. When you have a lot of reticular fibers, they're small, thin fibers. You can see in the picture here, they're small, thin fibers that will form almost like a screen or a mesh, and they'll filter things through that. Okay, so again, when we look at microscopes, you're going to see all different kinds of connective tissues, and we'll talk more about where you find each one of those. But this is kind of your overall of connective tissue. It can have one of the four basic functions, and they all have the same basic structure. So muscular tissue has three basic types: skeletal, which is what we think of when we think of muscle tissue; cardiac, which is found in the heart and the heart only, not blood vessels, only the heart; and smooth tissue, which is found as a general rule lining our hollow organs. That actually is what you would find in, sorry, you're able to see the red on the red there. That actually is what you would find in blood vessels, in your stomach, in your intestines. That's going to be your smooth muscle. The picture you see over here on your right, this is an example of skeletal muscle. That's what it will look like when you look at it under the microscope. All muscle, regardless of its kind, so no matter whether it's skeletal, cardiac, or smooth, regardless of its kind, its job is to produce movement or to generate force. Skeletal muscle does it in a very obvious way that we know we see. Our arms swing around, our legs move. We are producing movement and generating force. Cardiac muscle does that with our heart. Our heartbeat, you can feel it producing movement and generating force every time. The smooth muscle is the one we don't always know about. The smooth muscle is the one that's pushing the food through our intestine. It's the one that's changing the shape of the blood vessels to help us regulate body temperature. It's the one that's mixing the food up in our stomach. Okay? But it's still generating force and producing movement. It's pushing that, as a general, we're talking about food here, it's pushing that food along. And our fourth kind of tissue here is going to be our nervous tissue. So our nervous tissue has two basic functions: irritability and conductivity. Irritability does not mean that your nervous tissue is angry. It means that your nervous tissue is able to respond to a stimulus. We talked about this with feedback loops, okay, and homeostasis. Our stimulus is what causes the change. Our nervous tissue is the integration center. So this nervous tissue is able to receive this information and respond to the stimulus, make the decision. Okay? It also has the power of conductivity. So it can transmit messages. It can conduct electricity. That's how your nervous tissue transmits messages quickly down the length of it, is it conducts an electrical impulse. So it has that ability to conduct electricity down the length of the nervous cells. And you're going to have two basic types of cells here in this nervous tissue. You're going to have neurons, which is what we think of, that's what looks like this big squished bug here. This whole thing here, this is all neuron. That is what we think of when we think of nervous tissue as a general rule, is the neuron. This big, huge, squished bug-looking cell. And then you'll also have, you'll notice around it there are smaller cells. Those are your supporting cells. Those supporting cells are called your neuroglia. In the picture, they're labeled there, your neuroglial cell. Okay? But these are the supporting cells that help take care of these neurons, that help nourish those neurons. They help protect them immune-wise, but they help take care and support those nervous tissue, those neurons. And so when we get to the nervous tissue chapter, we'll talk more in depth about this. We'll talk more in depth about all of these different tissues. Okay? Epithelial tissue is going to pop up in almost every single unit that we do, but we'll have entire units devoted to connective tissue. Skeletal unit. We will have the blood unit. So entire units connected to that. We'll have an entire unit on skeletal muscle. We'll have an entire unit on the heart. We'll have an entire unit on this nervous tissue. So this is all we're going to do now to kind of hit those. Epithelial tissue is where the bulk of our information is coming from here. Okay, so you'll want to have these ready so that when you look under your microscope, you have an idea of what's happening and what you're looking at.